I have spent my career watching how governments mistake motion for strategy, and the abrupt shift from threats to an Oval Office invitation toward Colombia is a textbook case. One day, public rhetoric escalates to the point where leaders posture about armed resistance. Days later, the temperature drops with a phone call and a White House welcome framed around cooperation on drugs and regional stability. I recognize this pattern because it is what happens when intelligence is sidelined and narrative fills the vacuum. The reported hour-long call and invitation were presented as a diplomatic reset, a signal of control regained through personal diplomacy, but to an intelligence professional, it reads as improvisation after miscalculation, not foresight. The observation is simple. Policy lurched. The intelligence failure lies in confusing public signaling with leverage. When analysts are pressured to validate a leader-centric theory of influence, warnings about partner politics, domestic constraints, and regional dynamics get muted. Colombia's leadership has its own incentives, constituencies, and red lines. Threats do not translate cleanly into compliance, especially in a country with a long memory of sovereignty disputes and a complex security environment shaped by insurgency demobilization, narcotics economics, and border instability. Ignoring those realities produces policy whiplash. The strategic consequence is credibility erosion. Allies learn to wait out bluster, adversaries learn to probe. Each sharp turn tells partners that U.S. positions are provisional, subject to mood and media cycles. That weakens deterrence and cooperation alike. An invitation meant to project strength instead advertises uncertainty because it follows escalation without a clear intelligence-driven explanation of what changed on the ground. The analytical breakdown points to a familiar pathology. Collection is adequate. Analysis is constrained. Reporting that complicates the preferred storyline is discounted, while surface-level indicators, calls, photos, statements are elevated as proof of success. This is not diplomacy informed by intelligence. It is intelligence retrofitted to justify diplomacy already chosen. The hard lesson is uncomfortable but necessary. When intelligence becomes fiction, when narratives about toughness replace assessments about partners, policy becomes reactive theater. Sustainable outcomes in the hemisphere require patient, evidence-based engagement that respects local realities and avoids public ultimatums that force reversals. Abrupt pivots may calm headlines, but they do not repair the analytical damage that produced them. I have watched U.S. policy toward Latin America oscillate for decades, and the gap between rhetoric and reality has only widened. Public threats are issued as if they were instruments of precision, yet they are blunt tools that often collide with local politics we barely acknowledge. In the Colombia case, the rapid move from inflammatory language to conciliatory engagement exposed how thin the strategic planning really was. The narrative suggested firmness followed by magnanimity, but the reality was damage control after overreach. Intelligence should have warned that public ultimatums would box both sides in, forcing a reversal that undermines authority rather than consolidates it. The intelligence distortion here is the elevation of messaging over substance. Analysts are asked to assess reactions to statements rather than to evaluate structural drivers. Colombia's internal security balance, the economics of coca cultivation, the fragile post-conflict arrangements after demobilization, and the pressures from a volatile Venezuelan border. When policy centers on televised threats, intelligence becomes an after-action report instead of a planning tool. That inversion guarantees surprises because rhetoric does not change facts on the ground. The strategic consequence is a policy that looks decisive but behaves erratically. Latin American partners learn that U.S. engagement is episodic and personality-driven, not institutional. They hedge accordingly, diversifying relationships, delaying commitments, and extracting concessions when Washington backtracks. This weakens cooperation on precisely the issues invoked to justify the rhetoric, from counter-narcotics to migration management. Breaking this down analytically, the failure is not a lack of information, but a refusal to integrate it. Publicly available data has long shown that narcotics flows are resilient to coercive diplomacy, absent sustained rural development, judicial reform, and demand-side measures. Likewise, refugee pressures from Venezuela fluctuate with conditions inside Venezuela, not with sound bites issued in Washington. Intelligence assessments that emphasize these realities often collide with political timelines and are sidelined. The result is a cycle of exaggerated claims followed by quiet recalibration. The hard lesson is that hemispheric policy cannot be run on slogans. Credibility is built through consistency, not spectacle. Intelligence realism demands that leaders align words with feasible objectives and accept that influence in Latin America is negotiated, not imposed. When rhetoric outruns reality, reversals become inevitable, and each reversal teaches partners to discount the next warning. That is how strategic narratives decay, through repeated exposure of the gap between what is said and what can actually be done. When policy swings this abruptly, the underlying problem is rarely diplomatic skill, it is the absence of disciplined intelligence integration. I have seen this gap widen when leaders demand certainty and speed, while institutions are built for probability and patience. In the Colombia episode, the rush from confrontation to engagement suggests that decision makers were operating on surface impressions rather than on a synthesized intelligence picture. The warning signs were there. Colombia's leadership signaling domestic resolve, the limits of coercion in a sovereign partner, and the reputational costs of public threats. Those signals did not alter the course until the political cost became apparent, prompting a reversal framed as dialogue. The intelligence failure begins upstream. Collection captures statements, movements, and reactions, but analysis must contextualize them within enduring constraints. Instead, analysis was narrowed to short-term optics, how threats would play, how quickly pressure might yield a call, how a meeting could be spun as success. Dissenting views that cautioned against escalation were likely treated as cautionary noise. This is how politicization works in practice, not through falsified reports, but through selective attention. The strategic consequence is a feedback loop of volatility. Each policy swing teaches the system to value responsiveness over accuracy. Analysts learn that their influence peaks after a misstep, not before it, reinforcing reactive corrections instead of preventive guidance. Partners notice this rhythm and adapt. They delay responses, escalate rhetoric to create bargaining room, and wait for Washington to recalibrate. Intelligence that should reduce uncertainty instead becomes a post hoc rationalization. Analytically, the gap is institutional. The distance between assessment and action widens when leadership conflates decisiveness with effectiveness. Briefings are compressed into talking points, probabilities are flattened into binaries. Complex realities like Colombia's balancing act between security cooperation and political autonomy are reduced to compliance metrics. This distortion is subtle but corrosive. It produces confidence without competence and momentum without direction. The hard lesson is that intelligence must be restored to its proper role, informing choices before they harden into public positions. Once threats are issued, options narrow, and credibility is wagered. Realism demands that leaders tolerate ambiguity long enough to avoid spectacle-driven errors. Closing the intelligence gap does not slow policy. It prevents the costly reversals that expose how thin the original analysis was. Counter-narcotics has long been the rhetorical currency of U.S.-Colombia relations, but it is also where policy most often departs from intelligence reality. I watched this pattern take shape years ago, and it persists because leverage is repeatedly overstated. When Washington frames cooperation as something it can compel through pressure, it ignores the structural limits that intelligence assessments have documented for decades. Colombia's drug economy is not a switch to be flipped by threats or invitations. It is a complex system rooted in rural poverty, armed group adaptation, corruption, and global demand. The sudden pivot toward engagement, framed around renewed cooperation on drugs, revealed how little leverage public posturing actually produces. The intelligence distortion here is the simplification of causality. Policy rhetoric implies that if Colombia does more, flows will drop. Intelligence shows otherwise. Eradication spikes displace cultivation geographically. Trafficking networks reroute. Violence migrates. These dynamics are well documented and widely understood within the analytic community. Yet they are routinely set aside because they complicate the narrative of control. When leaders promise results tied to coercive diplomacy, intelligence warnings about substitution effects and lagging outcomes are treated as excuses rather than facts. The strategic consequence is misallocated pressure. By elevating narcotics cooperation as the centerpiece of leverage, Washington narrows the relationship and risks politicizing operational cooperation that depends on trust. Colombian institutions hear the message clearly. Cooperation is conditional and transactional. That undermines sustained intelligence sharing, which thrives on predictability and mutual respect, not public ultimatums followed by abrupt resets. Breaking this down analytically, the mirage of leverage persists because metrics are chosen to flatter policy. Short-term seizure numbers and announcement-driven initiatives are highlighted, while long-term indicators, cultivation, resilience, price stability, demand elasticity are ignored. Intelligence assessments that emphasize these deeper measures often lose out to talking points that promise immediate impact. The result is a cycle of claims and corrections, each reinforcing skepticism among partners who see the pattern repeat. The hard lesson is that leverage built on misunderstanding collapses quickly. Effective counter-narcotics cooperation requires acknowledging limits, aligning expectations, and integrating intelligence honestly into policy design. When threats give way to invitations without a change in underlying realities, it signals that leverage was never real. That recognition should prompt humility, but too often it prompts another narrative reset. Intelligence realism demands the former, because only grounded expectations can sustain cooperation without eroding credibility. Few dynamics are as routinely exaggerated in Washington as the spillover from Venezuela. And I say that having watched intelligence estimates get bent to fit political urgency. In the Colombia pivot, refugee pressure and border instability were invoked to justify both escalation and engagement, as if the situation demanded immediate theatrical moves. The reality is more measured. Venezuela's outflows rise and fall with internal conditions, economic shocks, and enforcement patterns, not with statements issued abroad. Intelligence reporting has consistently shown that neighboring states prepare incrementally, adjusting capacity over time. The sudden framing of urgency served narrative needs, not analytic ones, and helped rationalize a rapid shift in posture toward Colombia. The intelligence failure lies in conflating contingency planning with imminent crisis. Analysts routinely model worst cases to inform preparedness, but those scenarios are not predictions. When leadership treats them as forecasts, urgency is manufactured. In this case, speculative concerns about border surges were elevated into policy drivers, crowding out sober assessments of absorptive capacity, humanitarian logistics, and regional coordination mechanisms already in place. Intelligence that stressed continuity and manageability was overshadowed by claims that demanded visible action. The strategic consequence is distortion of priorities. Resources and attention are pulled toward headline risks, while chronic issues, governance, support, labor integration, public health receive less emphasis because they do not lend themselves to dramatic gestures. Partners notice this imbalance. They learn that invoking crisis language can accelerate engagement, while steady cooperation is taken for granted. Over time, this incentive system degrades honest reporting and encourages alarmism. Analytically, the spillover narrative persists because it aligns with familiar regime change assumptions. If collapse is always imminent, then pressure and rapid realignment appear justified. Intelligence assessments that highlight regime resilience, adaptive coping mechanisms, and the slow grind of deterioration are less politically useful. They complicate the story and dilute urgency. The result is a cycle where intelligence nuance is treated as obstruction, and policy oscillates between panic and fatigue. The hard lesson is that manufactured urgency corrodes strategic judgment. Intelligence realism requires distinguishing between plausible risk and probable outcome, and resisting the temptation to dramatize uncertainty. When spillover narratives are used to excuse abrupt policy swings, credibility suffers twice, first with partners who see the exaggeration, and then with analysts whose assessments are repeatedly ignored. Stability in the region depends on measured responses grounded in evidence, not on crisis narratives designed to justify reversals. Credibility is the currency of intelligence-informed policy, and it is spent fastest when reversals are public and poorly explained. The Colombia episode made that damage visible. After threats harden positions and invite nationalist posturing, a sudden pivot to engagement signals not flexibility but inconsistency. I have seen this play out repeatedly. Allies recalibrate their expectations downward, and adversaries test boundaries upward. Intelligence warnings about these second-order effects are often acknowledged and then overridden because credibility loss is diffuse and delayed while political pressure is immediate. The intelligence distortion here is temporal. Decision makers discount future costs in favor of present relief. An invitation to the White House quiets a controversy today, but it mortgages trust tomorrow. Partners begin to ask whether U.S. commitments are durable or contingent on the next news cycle. Intelligence assessments that map these reputational trajectories rarely carry the same weight as tactical fixes, even though they are more predictive of long-term outcomes. The strategic consequence is erosion across relationships, not just one. When a single partner experiences abrupt escalation followed by conciliation, others infer risk. They hedge by slowing cooperation, diversifying partnerships, and insulating themselves from U.S. pressure. Intelligence sharing suffers in subtle ways. Less candor, delayed reporting, narrower collaboration. These are not dramatic ruptures. They are quiet degradations that accumulate until the system underperforms. Analytically, credibility damage is difficult to quantify, which makes it easy to ignore. There is no immediate metric for trust lost, no chart that captures skepticism gained. Yet intelligence professionals track indicators changes in access, tone, responsiveness that reveal the trend. In this case, the visible whiplash in policy sent a signal that analysis is subordinate to optics. That perception travels quickly among diplomatic and intelligence communities. The hard lesson is that credibility cannot be restored through gestures alone. Invitations and statements do not erase the memory of threats. They sit alongside them. Intelligence realism demands that leaders choose consistency over spectacle and accept that restraint often preserves more influence than bravado. When credibility damage is in plain sight, the repair requires time and disciplined policy, not another narrative pivot. Ignoring that truth ensures the next reversal will cost even more. I have learned the hard way that strategic narratives do not fail all at once. They decay through repetition of small, avoidable errors. The Colombia pivot was not catastrophic by itself, but it was emblematic. It showed how policy built on rhetoric rather than intelligence produces a cycle of escalation, retreat, and rebranding that erodes confidence incrementally. When intelligence assessments are used to justify decisions already made, rather than to shape them beforehand, analysis becomes fiction in service of narrative, and narrative replaces strategy. The core observation is straightforward. The United States retains immense capabilities, but capability without credibility is diminished power. Intelligence failures in this context are rarely about missing data. They are about willful blindness to inconvenient facts. Colombia's sovereignty, the limits of counter-narcotics leverage, the manageability of refugee pressures, and the reputational costs of public threats were all knowable. They were known. What failed was the institutional discipline to let those facts constrain rhetoric. The strategic consequence of this failure is cumulative. Each episode teaches partners to discount American declarations and to plan for reversals. Over time, this weakens coalition management, degrades intelligence sharing, and reduces deterrence. Adversaries observe the same pattern and learn to exploit it, stretching timelines and absorbing pressure until Washington recalibrates. None of this requires conspiracies or malice. It emerges naturally when narrative management substitutes for analysis. Analytically, the lesson is that intelligence realism demands humility. Leaders must accept uncertainty, resist theatrical moves, and value assessments that complicate preferred stories. The intelligence profession is designed to inform, not to flatter. When its role is inverted, policy becomes performative, and outcomes deteriorate quietly but persistently. The hard lesson, then, is not about Colombia alone. It is about the cost of treating intelligence as a prop in a communications strategy. Rebuilding credibility requires recentering analysis, aligning words with feasible objectives, and abandoning the illusion that pressure without understanding produces control. Until that shift occurs, the American strategic narrative will continue to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions.